the Diving Deeper discussion series. I'm your host, Randy Isaac, and for the American Scientific Affiliation. And this is our ongoing new series that we started in January of discussing specific articles and book reviews in our journal Perspectives on Science and Christian Faith. We've got a great program for you today. We've got the authors of the key articles in our September 2020 issue, which was a theme issue on raising food for thought, all aspects of the global food chain. There's an awful lot to cover, so we have a lot to talk about. All the authors are here except Bob Sluka was not able to join us, and we have 4 people with us. There's Steve Hall, Jay Hollman, Matthew Morris, and Brittany Eater. And welcome all of them to the program. I'd like to just spend about, up to 5 minutes with each one of them so that you can get to know them, who they are, why they wrote the article, and some of the key elements of their article. And after those introductions, we're going to open it up to questions, and we'll have a dialogue and a robust discussion coming. So, first of all, let's turn to Steve Hall. I think, Steve, you were kind of like the guest editor, if I could call it, for this issue. Is that correct?
Correct.
All right, that's great. You did a terrific job. So, tell me, where are you from, Steve?
We live in North Carolina right now, but I think when James and I were talking, maybe originally, I may have actually still been living in Louisiana. So this was a little bit of time putting this thing together.
Did you grow up in Louisiana?
All my kids were born in Louisiana. I grew up in upstate New York.
Upstate New York, a bit of a switch.
So moved south a little bit.
Yeah. So where did you get your education?
My PhD is out of Cornell. So, but I also spent time at UC Davis, so I had a little California experience. And I lived in Buffalo for 7 years, so maybe I can't compare to Matthew, but I know a little bit about snow. And then postdoc at McGill, so I was in Canada.
McGill, okay, that's great. Yeah. Now, was that in agriculture or aquaculture, or what was your degree in?
My undergrad is mechanical engineering, and then I switched over to bio and ag engineering. And those departments have slightly different titles: biosystems engineering, bio and ag engineering, agricultural engineering.
Yeah. So, what was it that motivated you to write this article?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you, James, for the invitation, and thanks to all the co-authors and the reviewers, et cetera, who contributed. So this is great. But yeah, we've been thinking about this, and I think Jay Hollman probably got to me earlier than anybody else. So probably 15 or 20 years ago. I'm not quite sure how long. And we were talking at that time about one of Jay's, something that's on Jay's heart, and he's going to talk more about that, but food and health. And then I was kind of coming from the food and environment side. And so had an ongoing interest in this field for quite some time.
Oh, that's great.
They're important. They affect us all. I mean, we all eat. So we want a healthy environment, we want healthy bodies, but we have to eat. And so how do we do agriculture well and responsibly? And what's biblical approach to agriculture?
And your own career right now is in aquaculture, right? What is that?
Aquaculture. So fish. So terraculture is agriculture on land, and aquaculture is agriculture in the other 70% of the planet. So we got a lot of water on this planet. So freshwater aquaculture is part of it, but there is also saltwater aquaculture. And like other forms of agriculture, aquaculture has more and less sustainable forms. And of course, we're interested in the more sustainable forms.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. So now, turning to your article a bit, that was an incredible article, but you had more questions than you had answers. And unless you're going to answer them all in 25 words or less here, but could you kind of summarize what what you'd really like us to glean and remember from your article, and then later the audience can pick up and ask about it.
Admittedly, a very broad article, and an article with probably actually more questions than answers. So trying to give a framework of agriculture. It's the largest land use on the planet. And so as such, and again, something that you really can't not do something with regards to providing for human health. So we were very interested in that. And then we were looking at the different phases of it. So for example, growing your food, about the interaction with land and water and nutrients. And then also, that's not the end of it. That's part of it, right? Mm-hmm. And there might even be some details with regard to the seeds or the genetics. But then there's also the distribution of the food. There's the use of the food, maybe packaging. And so we've got at least one article on that. There's even questions about the sort of quality or health of the food. And you might even argue at the other end, what about the sort of life cycle of food and food-related products? Where do they go? Do some of them end up places we wouldn't want them to? How do we do better there? So, yes, lots of questions. I'm still asking questions. Where do they go? How do they end up? So, but my co-authors have done a great job of really answering some of those questions in more detail.
Okay, we'll get to them, and then discussion. Yeah, we're going to really end up wanting to know from you, what is it that we can really do in our daily lives about the whole issue. So, all right, but I see Jay Hollman is on. So Jay, welcome here. And Jay, you've been an ASA member for a very long time, and but a lot of these people don't know you. So who are you? Where'd you grow up, and how'd you get to this place?
That's great. I was born at a very young age, and
unlike the rest of us.
Yes. And I had the privilege of serving as the president of ASA at the turn of the century. It's a long time ago. And so, but I grew up in the state of Oregon. I went to college at Seattle Pacific and majored in chemistry. Then I went to Oregon Medical School. And then I did my postgraduate training at Emory University affiliated hospitals in Atlanta, Georgia. Learned how to speak.
Yeah, you're getting there.
And I moved to Cleveland, Ohio, and worked at the Cleveland Clinic. That was my first job of interventional cardiology there. But also there I encountered Caldwell Esselstyn, and we got interested in the idea of regressing coronary disease. And he had this terrible diet, 10% fat diet, vegan diet, but he thought it was helping people who had established coronary disease. So I got into it there, but actually even earlier than that, when I was still a medical resident, Dennis Burkett, who you may know of Burkett's lymphoma, but he was interested in bran, and he thought that bran was important for, fiber was important for it. So I said, whoa, this is, and he pointed out the big differences in terms of chronic disease between United States and that of Africa, where he was serving as, he really wasn't a missionary. He was in the British service in Uganda. I had a chance to go to Uganda once as a visiting professor and confirm the data that he said. And yeah, there are huge differences. So I started to think, what is that? And is that important? And how should we, then should we eat differently? Is there a biblical way to eat?
And your answer is?
Yeah, I was really helped a lot by the reviewers who kept coming back to me and said, don't just put all this other stuff in, try to relate it to scripture. And that's how the article emphasizes. And it's different, I think, than the book that we wrote on meat consumption. But yeah, that's the emphasis, is that yes, we probably should have a diet that's more like a Mediterranean or the DASH diet, but we have to be very cautious about, making this the 11th commandment.
So did you conclude then in your article here that Scripture gives us mandates or guidelines for an appropriate diet, or do you think it's irrelevant for today's age?
Well, I think Scripture doesn't do science. It's not, we get science is a whole nother way of knowing. Scripture tells us to treat others with grace. I think that's what it says. And it says, somebody says I don't eat anything but vegetables. You say, great, but that shouldn't be something that divides Christians. I mean, it's the old saying used to be, I'm an evangelical Christian and I'm a homeschooler. And, people would be, well, we send our kids to public school. Well, I'm a Christian and I'm a vegan. No, I mean, that's not the thing that should divide us.
Okay. All right. I'm sure we'll pick up on that and get into a discussion later. Let me first introduce Matthew Morris. Matthew, there you are. Okay. So, you'll have to unmute yourself. Good. So where are you from, Matthew?
I am coming to you from Calgary, Alberta today. We do have some snow, although it's actually pretty nice out right now. The snow is melting. I have 3 little kids who are playing out in the backyard while I do this right now.
All right. Is that where you grew up?
No, I'm from Southern Ontario, a little town called Hagersville, just south of Toronto.
Okay. All right. And where did you get your education? What's your degree in?
I have a bachelor's of religious education from Alberta Bible College out here in Calgary. Then I went out to Dalhousie in Halifax and got a Bachelor of Science in Marine Biology. And from there, I moved back out to Calgary again. I just loved it out here that much that I did my master's and PhD out here, working with a little fish called the three-spined stickleback.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. So tell us a little bit about this article. How'd you get into that? I have to admit that I got lost in all the names, but you'll have to just don't give us a test on these names or anything. But we're going to get the essence of naming a little bit. So how'd you get onto this particular topic, and what would you like us to remember from this article?
Sure. Well, I got onto the topic, I guess, first as a kid who came to know fish as these filleted, breaded things that you see on your plate. And, I could name a handful of these creatures, but I knew next to nothing about them. Then I came during my undergrad to appreciate these creatures as things that needed protection. In Canada, we have these cod stocks that had collapsed during my lifetime that really harmed the economy of the Maritimes. And I ended up working with Jeff Hutchings at Dalhousie, who in part was responsible for shutting down these cod stocks. So I got to work with him on farm salmon and wild salmon and the interactions between them. So I came to appreciate them as these creatures that needed saving. Then in my master's and PhD, I began to appreciate these creatures as things with their own lived experiences, their own complex behaviors. The stickleback do these little dances to attract their mates. They build nests. There's parental care. And this isn't atypical of fish. Fish have these really complex, remarkable behaviors that we just miss. We don't think about them in those sorts of ways like we might for mammals or birds. And so that just completely changed how I view these creatures as food items. So from there, I learned a bit about mislabeling, that our fish were being sold as one thing, but they were in fact another thing. And I thought this would be a great sort of citizen science initiative for my undergraduate genetics students if we could go out and sample fish from local vendors and sample their DNA and see are they getting what they thought they got. And it turns out it's really easy to find evidence of mislabeling. So the message that I would ask you guys to take from the paper is that in Genesis 1, God blesses the fish before he blesses anything else. He blesses them to be fruitful and to multiply. And then he blesses us with the same sort of thing, and then puts the fish under our responsibility. And so our ability to flourish cannot be at the expense of the fish's ability to flourish. And there's all sorts of things that are damaging fish stocks. One of the few sources of wild-caught protein that we still routinely consume. But one of the big issues is how we name these products. Ambiguous labels where we aren't aware of the type of creature we're consuming, so we don't know if we're eating an endangered species or not. and then fraudulent labeling. Collectively, those two things, ambiguous labels and fraudulent labels, they harm the fish, but they also harm us. They harm our pocketbook, and they harm our health. And so there's this whole notion of co-flourishing, that the fish and humans need to flourish together. We can't be at odds with one another. So I would just encourage you to think about these creatures that you're eating, not just, a fish. There's over 30,000 species of these things. What exactly is it that you're eating? What kind of creature is it? What's its lived experience like, and how can we eat them more sustainably?
Wow, that's quite a challenge, and I feel somewhat overwhelmed. I mean, I could see that that's a good thing, but I find a huge barrier between my willingness and interest in getting to know these names, and from actually correlating that to what I see in the fish market or the food market. How in the world could I ever discover what is going on? That seems to be an enormous amount of work. So maybe in our discussion time, we'll get some of your ideas on this, because I just find myself, I'm going to have to take your article and refer to that. I mean, I don't even know how to do that. So we'll get into what we can all do when it gets there. But
absolutely.
First, let me introduce Brittany Eater, and she's with us here as the author of the article on plastics. And Brittany, welcome here. And you work with Arosha, is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. Tell us a little bit about yourself. Where did you grow up? Where did you go to school?
Yeah, I grew up, raised, not born, in southern Wisconsin, and have spent most of my life here. I live in Sparta, Wisconsin now with my husband and our 2 dogs. So if they need to go outside, you might see them walking behind me. And I attended the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where I received my Bachelor's of Science in Wildlife Ecology. And then I worked for 4 or 5 years and went back to get a master's in environmental conservation from the Nelson Institute there at UW-Madison.
That's great. And so when did you join Arosha?
I started working with Arosha in August of 2019, but I'd known of the organization for many years. It had honestly been a dream of mine to work for Arosha because of our commitment to biodiversity conservation.
Yeah. And your co-author, Bob, wasn't able to join us here, but I think he had been with the organization a little longer. Is that correct?
Yeah. Dr. Sluka, Bob, is the international director for the Marine Conservation Program, the international program, but he also oversees the marine conservation work here in the U.S. So
how did you focus on this topic of plastics?
So I actually moved to Florida in 2019 in order to work with Bob on the marine conservation projects. And so we have been conducting plastic pollution research on the Atlantic coast there, just outside of Titusville, Florida, in collaboration with community scientists, but also conducting our own research, sifting essentially beach sand samples for microplastics, as well as conducting nurdle surveys. Nurdles, as if you read the paper, are plastic pellets that haven't yet been created into a final product. So they're a primary form of microplastic. So that was really the, which we took the call for paper and said, well, plastic is everywhere. And we know from our research and from reading that plastic pollution has indeed infiltrated the food chain in a number of ways.
Okay. All right. That's great. So, all right. It's been good to get a brief introduction from all of you. And at this point, I'd like to ask Vicki to kind of enable everyone to unmute themselves and we can start a discussion. Would like to ask all of you to keep yourselves muted unless you're asking a question, but don't forget to unmute yourself when you do ask. And the way this was going to operate in general, if you indicate to me either through the chat or some other kind of venue here that you would like to ask a question, you raise your hand or something, then I will call on you and you can unmute yourself and ask the question. And we're going to start with some of you folks who submitted your questions in advance. And Steve Huffy had a question he's going to ask, but I don't see you on here. Steve, are you did I just not see you correctly?
Thanks.
There he is. Oh, okay, there you are. All right. So, Steve, you had a question for us. You kind of want to get the ball rolling.
Sure. Thanks. And I enjoyed the article that Brittany and her partner wrote tremendously. It helped me ask where's technology headed in the future, and what can we do now as we wait for technology and use it. And to sort of explain, maybe a comment and then focus questions. Some plastics, rather than being derived from oil, can be developed from live biological sources such as sugarcane, seaweed, corn, bacteria, and trees, etc. By definition, a plastic is something, quote, fit to be formed. But chemically, it is long-chain polymers made from more simple monomers. Among plastics, consumables like cups, plasticware, bags, packaging have enormous economic and cumulative environmental effect. A question and challenge arises about polymers derived from live sources. Can they be formed to degrade at a molecular level and recycle to water, CO2, and biomass, hopefully without harmful residues? They need to retain qualities of flexibility for bags or tensile strengths for other applications such as plasticware. That's difficult. That is there a way to make biodegradable plastic for consumables which can re-enter the environment in a life-sustaining way? That's the first question. Secondly, do we need to opt for national laws like Denmark and some other Scandinavian countries Denmark has had for 30 years, which require beverage manufacturers to use glass containers which can be recycled? Can this apply to present plastic containers on grocery shelves? Denmark has shown that over the life of recycled glass bottles, they are about 10 times or more less expensive to use and maintain than one-time use plastic. So to summarize, two questions arise. Where's technology headed in the future, and what can we do now?
Thank you so much, Steve, for those questions. I will give my best answers that I can, but if you ask that question tomorrow, the answers might be different, because in particular with the first question about where is technology headed, because things are moving really rapidly. I did a tiny bit of research, having had your question ahead of time, and found an open access research paper that I'll put into the chat box for future reference if anybody wants to read it.
Thank you.
The short answer is that yes, there are bioplastics. Right now, they only constitute about 1% of global plastic use. And the main question with these bioplastics is how do they degrade? Enzymes are needed. Often fungal activity is needed in order to break these products down. Unfortunately, the bioplastics that you can buy today, like you can find them in grocery stores. I've purchased bioplastic utensils for, at a barbecue or whatever. The issue is that they don't break down in a traditional landfill, and they don't break down in traditional sort of composting. You can purchase these compostable plastics, but unfortunately, they don't do what the label says they do, except under certain circumstances, which is often there's something added to help it break down, whether that's enzymes or there's a specific process with heat, pressure. So I think there's demand for bioplastics that will degrade. Like you said, though, the problem is that plastics are the reason that we really use them is because they don't break down. If we had a plastic bag that disintegrated, and I guess we've all probably had grocery bags that fell apart because there was too much in them and they were too thin. But for the most part, plastic is useful to us because it is robust. So there's a balance to be found in trying to create a product that will biodegrade, but not too quickly. And to your second question, it's really complex. I'm grateful to hear about the example that you provided. But one of the United States, I think, special problems is how large we are and how much shipping takes place, right? So glass is way heavier than plastic. So to truck, say, glass bottles from Mexico, they have the best Coca-Cola comes in a glass bottle from Mexico because they use real sugar. If you were going to ship that via interstate to Wisconsin or New Jersey or wherever, it's going to use a lot more fuel, fossil fuels in the truck because of how much heavier glass is. And so there's these trade-offs that, I don't know what the answer is there. But I think something that we can do is to use less plastic. Often things like soda aren't healthy for us anyway, which maybe Jay would like to speak into. So just avoiding the plastic or even the glass at all is a good step. One of the interesting things that we have to contend with, though, are bans on banning plastic. So you can do a kind of a quick Google search and find a map of states where there are plastic bans, say for like grocery bags. But then there are states that have bans on banning plastic bans. And those are often coming, like the bans on plastic bans are originating in plastic companies and bottle companies like Pepsi, Coca-Cola.
We didn't hear that. Okay. All right, good. So thank you very much on that. The next question was submitted by Del Kuhn. Del, I know I saw you on here somewhere.
Yes,
and
yes, I unmuted.
Go ahead. Yeah, there you go. All right.
Okay, thanks, Randy. And thank all the authors for their work. I was basically even blown away by the number of reference pages. So what I'm shooting for in a question is, what do the four of you think our future priorities ought to be? The agriculture we have now really did grow out of a Christian consensus, at least in Francis Schaeffer's sense of the general tenor of a society. And about half the guys in a Christian group at University of Illinois at Champaign in the late 50s, or late 60s, I'm not that old yet, were ag econ majors. So for me, looking at it, it seems to me that our 2020s priorities are going to be different than the 1920s and are likely to be different than the 2050 priorities. I'm thinking that maybe our big ones are going to be feeding the larger world population today, making sure we can do it tomorrow, even at the cost of trade-offs, say in maybe factory farming, genetic modification, bioreactors for meat protein. So for you people in the industry, what's our priorities today? What trade-offs should we accept and assume that our next generation is going to make the corrections that we didn't make?
Wow, who wants to tackle that one?
Thanks, Dale.
Steve.
Send us an easy one. Yeah. So, but I think in your email, you actually said you would not accept any limit or any compromise. And in other words, there is some compromise that is acceptable, and then there are limits to that. And I would agree. I think part of the discussion is where, how much of a, compromise is acceptable, and really what you're talking about is, if you sort of maybe take a purist approach, does that end up leaving people without food? And that is something I think we as Christians would say is unethical. If we are able to provide for people, then we should. I think the big discussion now, and there's probably a bunch of different versions of it, each of our authors would have contributions, is how do we put the pieces together to provide for another maybe 2 billion or so more people before 2050, and yet do it while not only preserving but hopefully even putting back some of these species. So Matthew talked about the cod, but how do we not only reduce the amount of species that are going extinct or are under pressure, but maybe even restore? And I think that's a biblical term to restore some of these species. So it's a tall order. I think Jay would probably say something like maybe more vegetables and less meat will, in fact, in general, have less impact on the planet. Each of our other authors would have other specific details. I think that's, interestingly enough, I would say if you were just going to do one thing, cutting down on meat, and Jay made a big deal about saying you don't have to go to zero, but and maybe it's not good to sort of make that the final point. I'm not going to be your friend if you ever eat meat, but rather thinking of meat as something that maybe is a celebration food that you eat a little bit of, not as something that you eat so much, because meat does, depending on what meat it is, it does have more impact on the planet than vegetable-based products. So I'll stop at that point. I think some of the other co-authors might have some additional comments.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else want to tackle that?
I think that one of the issues that I came across as I began to look at the agriculture end of this is half the people in India work in agriculture. Half the people in China work in agriculture. What's going to happen if these countries become mechanized so that only 1 or 2% of their population, like in the States, works in agriculture? Where are the jobs going to come for those people? This is a tremendous social up change as well, that we have to think as a whole part of the whole process. And our mechanized agriculture is wonderfully efficient. The big issue now for us is obesity and what's making us fat. Part of it is the processed foods that we're eating. And Michael Pollan is probably right about that. Eat mostly food, you had to eat real food. So trying to stay away from the processed foods, which are engineered to be delicious and to cause us to overeat, is another thing to do.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, your comment about what are all these agricultural workers going to do, you would have said the same thing in 1900 for America, right? Almost 90% of the jobs were agricultural based back then. And I could see us having that same concern then. And we've certainly had an explosion of alternative populations. It's down to about 3% now for employment in agriculture. That's an amazingly fast change. Are you suggesting that perhaps China and India wouldn't be able to make that same kind of change?
Steve, why don't you answer that?
Well, maybe I should just leave it there.
Well, like it, and we talk about this within the field a lot. Things are happening whether you or I want them to happen or not. So it's more a matter of how do we essentially steer this vote in a sensible direction. And Brittany talked about the fact that there are ethical and political and monetary, amongst other things, impacts. But there are ways to steer that. So you mentioned one company that shall remain unnamed, but let's say a large multinational that does certain things, and some of those things are maybe not so good, but some of those companies have also brought on sustainability experts and et cetera in response to a certain amount of public pressure. So, I mean, public pressure can influence those companies to sort of do the right thing or at least explore that. Some of it's also, what am I willing to buy? And I know there's an ongoing discussion in the chat, maybe multiple ongoing discussions in the chat. Great discussion. But sort of what our little decisions do add up. And so if we buy more locally, if we buy maybe a little lower on the food chain, so to speak, towards the plant end of the product side, if we are a little bit more thoughtful about what we do, maybe we can collectively have an impact. But I also think there are ways where we have to influence the big players, the big companies and the governments to push things in the right direction. So that's not really a complete answer, but maybe some suggestions. Brittany, if you want to say something, please.
Well, I confess to be of two minds, trying to listen and trying to address questions in the chat at the same time. Somebody mentioned Michael Pollan earlier. I love his short quip to eat food, not too much, mostly plants. Thinking about everyday people like us, shifting something small, say in our diet, like you said, eating further down the food chain, eating a diversity of plants, legumes, whole grains, that's gonna affect change at the local and regional scale. We're seeing, I think, a proliferation of farmers markets and of people being very interested in local agriculture. Of course, there is some romanticism around farming, which we have to be careful to be truthful about what it's like to be a farmer and agriculturalist. But yeah, I think it's a collective action at the local scale. It's grassroots and grass tops, as they say, action that is needed.
Matthew, can I ask you a specific question along these lines? Because I know when I grew up, in Kansas, you had no selection, no choice process. Fish was just not an option, except for the frozen varieties, and you had no idea what it was. So unless you live close to the coast, it's not like you can go to a farmer's market to select your fish in very many places, maybe by the lakes in Wisconsin, I don't know, but it's not there. But in general, I feel like we're limited in what we can do and focused on the fish. What recommendations do you have then for diet selections, fish selections, or understanding what we're eating for the bulk of us?
I'm in a landlocked province here. An ocean is on the other side of the mountains, and yet we still have a stunning diversity of fish that are brought into our markets. Many of which are farmed products imported from Norway. That not all of these species are even Canadian species, or I assume that's the same down where you're at. They're American, and they're also international imported fish. So I guess I would say, first of all, as we think about eating down the food chain, I think that's very true. Consuming fewer fish if we can. I know there's a big push with omega-3s and these sorts of things, but the jury's kind of out on omega-3s and how necessary they are in our diets. So reducing the number of fish that we eat, I think, is the first thing. Seriously considering the types of fish that we're consuming. Salmon, for instance, take a lot of other fish. They need to eat a lot of other fish in order to build those creatures, or tuna. But there are fish lower on the trophic level, like anchovies, that might be somewhat better to consume. But also supporting traceability and new aquaculture initiatives that can bring and Steve can talk way better about this than I can, but doing more land-based aquaculture that reduces some of the ecological harms to marine spaces, and supporting things like marine protected areas that are going to go a big way to solving the marine fish crisis. I mean, this is big picture. There's a ton of stuff involved here at national levels, at international levels. But us as individual consumers, I think, could do best by reducing the amount of fish that we eat, by coming to know a handful of those fish. It's not that hard to learn the couple species of salmon we have and the 14 some species of tuna that might be on our plate, and to put pressure to actually label those two species. I don't know what it's like in the States. In Canada, I can just buy tuna, and that could be anything from a critically endangered species to a species of least concern, and I have no idea. So it's up to me to purchase things that are labeled to the species level, and not buy those things that are so ambiguous that I can't determine their particular status.
You mentioned salmon consuming a lot of fish and so on. We hear a lot about farmed salmon versus wild salmon. Can you comment on that?
Again, I think Steve could probably comment better than I. I've done work on the genetic interactions, so hybridization between farmed and wild Atlantic salmon. The truth is, on the Canadian coast and even going down into Maine, wild Atlantic salmon are doing real bad. They've declined upwards of 70% since the 1960s or something like this. They're not doing well. So you would think that salmon farming would be the answer. But a lot of the salmon farming, at least in Canada, is done in these huge sea cages right outside of or in the mouth of wild salmon rivers. What ends up happening is there's a storm, 100,000 salmon escape right next to a river that supports 2,000, 4,000 wild salmon. So you get this huge influx of farmed salmon into these rivers. These farmed salmon are, let's say, not as equipped to deal with the wild environment. So a lot of them will die, but they're also ill-equipped to reproduce appropriately. So they will end up making their nests a little bit later in the year, and they'll smother the nests of the wild salmon. And so those eggs don't get oxygenated. If they do hybridize or they do breed with the wild salmon, those hybrids it's kind of like taking a wolf and a chihuahua and mating them together and saying survive in the wild, and it's just not going to happen. Salmon are adapted to their local river conditions, and these farm salmon are adapted to the farmed condition, and they're typically of genetic stock that was taken from a different river system. So they start with these adaptations that aren't typical of that area, and then we alter those in the farmed environment. And it turns out it takes just a couple generations to change that original wild stock into genetically distinct farm stock that are more aggressive and less suited to the wild. So our current salmon farming practices are not a great solution to the reduced levels of wild salmon that we currently encounter.
Steve, any comment on that?
Well, so aquaculture is about 4,000 years behind the rest of agriculture, and it is, similarly primitive. So, aquaculture in some ways is roughly where slash and burn agriculture is or has been, and with similar, unintended side effects. The difference really, I think, is the demand. I mean, when slash and burn was originally practiced, several thousand years ago, there was more wilderness and fewer humans. Now you have billions of humans, so you can have these massive market forces that are encouraging, and I would agree with Matthew that a number of the aquaculture practices are unsustainable. I would clarify that some of the other aquaculture practices, in fact, are probably really wonderful. They're probably one of the best sources in terms of efficient conversion to healthy protein products, some aquaculture. Now, in my own work, we tend to try to work with local species, and then we try to work down the food chain. So we are very interested in some of the local species here in the mid-Atlantic, and we're interested also in things like shellfish, which are filter feeders. So they are filtering out algae and other things out of the water. So they're actually essentially in some ways enhancing the water quality. And this is, I'm always looking for things that like not only don't make it so bad, but actually maybe even make something a little better. You know, and is it possible to do some of that? And then macroalgae, which by the way is the largest aquaculture product in the world, is macroalgae, is seaweed. And so in some parts of the world, people eat a fair amount of that. In the U.S., we eat some. My kids actually love it. So, you know, it's a real product, but it is certainly not, it's interesting, sort of pound for pound, that stuff is cheap, salmon's expensive, and rich Americans not only are willing, they demand it. Please charge me $10 or $20 a pound. I want that. Unfortunately, you know, you would think at $10 or $20 a pound, you could do this really efficiently. Unfortunately, it tends to kind of lean the other way. People do it however they can. Another question that I do want to just throw out there, and I put it in the chat as well, is this question of truth that is very central to Christians, both truth with a capital T and then truth with a small t in terms of just understanding accurate information. And in this era with so much false information, so there's always been fake news, but now we got more of it. How do we discern wisely what is true? And, you know, so that I certainly think PSCF is, in terms of good peer-reviewed, good quotes, good science and good theology, a pretty unique place for that. But I think that's a huge question. You know, the elephant in the room has been floating over on the chat as being the population, but I think the other elephant in the room is good, accurate information of truth. And that's really hard to get. And you know, this little discussion between Matthew and I is getting down into the nuance, right? Where you so should I buy salmon or not? Should I buy wild salmon or farm salmon or neither or both? Or, you know, and honestly, Matthew and I probably haven't given you a good answer, except to probably say I would still push you down the food chain and say buy seaweed, buy oysters, buy something lower on the trophic level. I think that in general is sort of good advice on land or in the water. But a lot of it's also this sort of out of step time that we're very, very primitive in terms of aquaculture compared to agriculture. And there's a learning curve, you know. So I suspect, I hope that in another 20 or 30 years, I'll be able to say straightforward, learn, you know, go ahead and buy some good, sustainably, got the stamp on it and it's good. At this point, that's a little harder to say.
But Steve, how far down can we go? Okay, so we're here by the Massachusetts Bay. We can go out and get what? Pogies and plankton and you know, we're not going to put that on our plates very soon.
There are chefs that are working on various kinds of unami and things like this that are, you know, sort of sexy plant-based aquatic, you know, and it's part of it is sort of how you look at it. How can you make it a sort of attractive thing? But it's like anything else, you know. Do I like it? Do I commit to it? Do I get used to it? And of course, there's lots of vegetarians or maybe near vegetarian. You know, this other thing in the chat has to do with many of us are expressing that, you know, I eat a lot less meat. Some people are saying I'm vegetarian or vegan, but even just less meat. And I think that is a trend, and I think it's probably a healthy trend. I think Jay would concur with that.
Well, I love my salmon. I've managed to move from a virtually all red meat diet to an almost all salmon, but you're telling me to look a little bit lower in the food chain. Boy, I'll have to see about that. Okay, we had another question submitted by Ms. Waldy. I don't know how to pronounce your name. Are you on somewhere? I don't know. You wrote a question, but you didn't answer me as to whether you'd be here. Are you here? Ms. Waldy, W-O-L-D-E. you're not here. But I'll just say the list of questions she sent for you, Jay, was rather extensive here, but it has to do a little bit with the scriptural dietary guidance that we got from Moses on through, and a lot of references in Scripture about diet. How do you position that? Are they at all prescriptive for us? Are they helpful guidance? Are they things we can safely ignore? We'll just focus on science. How do you view that, Jay?
I think that the ceremonial law in the Old Testament, which separated clean and unclean, was very prescriptive, but and is still, of course, practiced by Orthodox Jews in our current day. But I think like other aspects of the ceremonial law, I think Jesus pronounced everything clean. And so I don't think that still applies to us as Christians in the 20th century. People have tried for a long time to try to say, oh, there's a scientific reason for this. There's a hidden science between why you shouldn't eat, but it's been looked at, and from everything I know about nutritional science, that's not true.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you're basically saying view any dietary kind of comments in Scripture as something that was kind of the cultural perspective at the time, or served a different purpose, and isn't really normative for us today.
Yeah, I think that the purpose of the dietary laws, as I've read several commentators, this is my own idea, they say that the reason was to create a distinctive people. And part of that was, okay, we're going to worship God, we're going to eat this way, we're going to have separation of this. And that was part of what they were trying to establish. And then Jesus comes along, abolishes so many things from the Jewish ceremonial traditions.
So there was an ulterior motive, but that motive was not necessarily our physical health, but it was more of the distinctiveness of the people.
Yes, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. How about Terry Gray? You said you had something you wanted to say about plastics. You've been active on the chat here too. Why don't you speak up and share at least one of your questions and comments on plastics?
Sure. So I did comment on this in the chat here, just get some feedback from it.
Oh, you got too many coronaviruses behind you. I don't know.
Yeah, I have a lot of coronaviruses.
They're going to be transmitted to us.
Would you walk out in the city if you knew those were there?
Well, if that's all there were, that's not too bad.
Anyway, we've got this carbon issue with respect to CO2 emissions, and of course, we want to do things that get rid of that. But it seems to me that plastics, if you will, could be a solution to carbon sequestration. Getting carbon out of the atmosphere, taking carbon out of point sources where fossil fuels are being burned, and I really can't get any buy-in on this from different people I've talked to. Everybody wants to sequester carbon and then use it for something useful. Turn it back into fuel or turn it into plastics or useful plastics or whatever. But I think plastic is a form of keeping carbon out of the atmosphere, and as long as we don't let it end up in the ocean, that's a terrible thing. But it seems to me that is probably a higher priority for us than plastic pollution. Again, to just rank things, that keeping CO2 out of the atmosphere and actually bringing it down is a very high priority for us in terms of the short-term issues related to global warming and climate change.
Brittany?
Thanks, Terry. I am not familiar enough with the sorts of technologies that would be able to take CO2 out of the atmosphere and do something to them to make them into plastic. I think, if that were possible, I think that it would be brilliant. And maybe it will be in the future. I'm not aware of any such technologies, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist right now. And I put this in the chat, but most plastics are made from natural gas, which we access via fracking. So if we're thinking full circle about plastics, and maybe being able to agree that there are a lot of plastics created that are unnecessary. How many plastic trinkets do we have that you get in a kid's meal at some fast food chain? It exists for, oh, wow, that's impressive.
There's my plastic trinket.
Just imagining all of the creative products that humankind has come up with to make out of this amazing material. Most of it is unnecessary, and ultimately it would be best to leave that natural gas in the ground rather than fracking to bring it up to create something that is unnecessary and will ultimately probably end up in the environment. The research on global plastic production and fate is pretty astonishing. 9% globally has been recycled, 12% has been incinerated, and the other 79% are in landfills or have escaped to the environment, most of which, of course, ends up in the oceans. Plastic pollution is a big problem, but one of the things I found that united all of our papers really was talking about fish. And so if we take fish as an example, their greatest threat, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Matthew, is probably overfishing, historically and today, globally. Plastic pollution maybe isn't the issue right now that is the biggest threat to fish. But there is such a high volume of plastic pollution most of it is too small to be seen by the human eye. This idea of biblical wisdom and the secular precautionary principle, I think, is really key as we weigh what are these issues and what do we do about them. Terry, you mentioned ranking issues. I find that to be a really useful exercise, but at the same time, we can't disregard the things that might be ranked slightly lower.
Wow.
One thing I want to comment on from your paper, I worry more about, less about plastics itself, but what is part or in the plastic. So these flame retardants, these plasticizers, these other chemicals, and you mentioned a list of them that they seem to have endocrine disruptor functionalities biologically, and that affects fish, amphibians, ourselves. In ways, and we're finding those compounds everywhere. Not just the plastics, the carbon polymers, but these
the forever chemicals.
These things that are associated with plastics.
I've got a couple of comments I got to put in here. First of all, you mentioned about overfishing, and I think that's really true. But living here as we do in Gloucester, Massachusetts, that's really hot button on local politics, because such a large community of people who make their living fishing, and it's a real fishing industry here. And anytime there are limits on their production, it really reduces their income. So it's a short-term income versus long-term survivability issue, which boy, you can get a lot of heated discussions around here. But let's move that aside a little bit. I want to focus on what both you, Brittany, and Terry were saying about plastics, and what gets me going here is the recycling issue. Because both of you indicated, I mean, the numbers you said, Brittany, indicates that, hey, it's like at least 80% or so of plastics are not getting recycled. Maybe it was even more. But here, I at least remember back in the days before anybody was doing recycling. That was many decades ago. But I'm amazed at how our society has changed to the point where recycling is ubiquitous. I mean, virtually everyone I know has bought into the recycling thing, and it's most of us are fanatical about recycling. Anything that's glass, anything that's plastic, paper. Hey, you put in recycling, and it's wonderful. And hey, I take that recycling bin out to the street every week, and I can pat myself on the back and say, hey, how wonderful a job I've done here. So, and then I come to learn in the last few years here a little bit that. Hey, this is all a farce. Most plastics can't be and aren't being recycled, and most of it gets away from us. And I feel gypped. I mean, I feel cheated. Hey, haven't been given the right information here. And like what do I do when I get plastic now? Should I put it in the recycling bin, or should I put it in the trash where it goes to the landfill? These are practical, everyday considerations. What do you think?
Totally. So the first thing that everyone should do is research their local municipal rules around recycling, because that little symbol, those 3 arrows, triangle on the bottom of your plastic, that does not indicate that it is a recyclable item. It simply
that's where we've been cheated. We've all been told that
recycling was a great PR move back in the few decades ago by aforementioned shall remain unnamed multinational soda companies. Not to be blunt, but it was a good bit of marketing to encourage people to consume more. Unfortunately, recycling happens at a more local level where there's great variation in what is recyclable at your particular municipality. So you have to research your local area, what they accept, whether or not it's a single stream system where you can put everything into one bin, or you have to separate your paper from your plastics from your glass, and even what number of plastics they take, because those numbers indicate a general chemical composition of plastic. So whether it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7, those are all different types of plastic. Some recycling facilities will take, say, numbers 1, 2, and 5, because those are more lucrative to be sold, to be reused. So you really, that's the first and most important thing you have to do. And then from there, maybe make consumer decisions to avoid products which are not recyclable. That's one option. And I don't know if anybody else wants to weigh in, but
I find those numbers hard to read. It takes you a long time to figure out. Most of them are so small, and maybe it's my aging eyes or something, but they're hard to discern. And I've been reading different articles that say, hey, in anything other than 1 and 2, for all practical purposes, some of 5 or whatever, really can't be recycled. So we've got single stream processing here. Everything gets thrown in.
Randy?
And you're telling me don't do that. Yes, John.
Randy, if I could just jump in here. This is a very important discussion, and you're getting to a real key piece. As a consumer, we get really frustrated with the information and the lack of information Bethany talking about. It's really important, Brittany. the issue here is that we're having a discussion among natural scientists and engineers mostly. And what you're dealing with here is both political decisions that are made, right, governance decisions, but also economics of this. Here in Edmonton, we had years ago one of the best recycling systems. We still have it, a blue bag system. We separate and do all that. They built these big composters. Well, it turned out that whole system has collapsed locally. We dutifully recycle. We put out these bags. They're basically going to the landfill now because they have no market for them. So that plastics and paper and cloth was being sent internationally. So these complex globalized markets. And for an individual to keep up with all that, I'm an academic and I can't keep up with it. I'm given free time to do research on this and I can't track it. And so that I think there's an issue here on trying to think through, how do we think better about this? How do we speak better about it? Jay, it gets back to the questions I think you raised about earlier about truth and communication, how we speak with one another. So opening up these places for these complex interdisciplinary conversations, I think, are important.
Well, we all want it simple too. So, so ASA is going to send us out a weekly update about what's really good recycling and what isn't. Science, and we'll be able to go on the website and just pick up what we should throw away and what's going to go to China and which is going to go to the.
Well, Terry, what Terry is saying here is that if it plastic ends up in the landfill, it kind of has some benefits. It keeps it from getting into the ocean for the most part, and can sequester the carbon that was used in making it, and has some benefits. So why should I keep putting plastics in the recycling? Why don't I just dump it all into the trash for the landfill?
Well, Randy, more goes there than you probably think.
Yeah, it goes there anyway, but then why do I pay the recycling guy?
Even if you put it in the recycle, in Fort Collins, recycling is free. It's the landfill
free. We all pay for it.
We pay for it. But until recently, recycling is not a profitable business, and most of that. And just until 2 or 3 years ago was, and I think in the article they talk about this. A lot of that just went to China, and China, they're better at recycling than we are historically, both with metals and plastics, and they do what they are able to do, and there's very cheap labor that enables them to do the kind of sorting that we don't like doing or aren't willing to do. But then, what's not recycled, what's left over, they typically just dump in the river, and that's how it gets into the oceans. I think the river pollution in countries that take our plastic and try to recycle it, that's how it ends up in the ocean. In large measure, so at least that's what I've become convinced of.
So what I should do is one of these days just follow the recycling truck and see where it goes and just look at it and say, all right, what's happening?
No, that's I do this electronic waste class at CSU as well, and that's. Knowing, taking your waste products to, waste management or to Best Buy to put in the recycle box, it might make you feel good and it might be, the recommended thing to do, but, you got to be really careful about where it goes after that. And, it's not always so crystal clear, and there's no good legislation on a lot of these issues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and sometimes we just don't feel like making the effort to think about it. It's too much work, It's just a lot easier to go get some fast food or whatever, and that's it. Mm-hmm.
Well, it's a version of not in my backyard.
Yeah.
We don't take care of our own pollution and our own waste.
Right.
We send it somewhere else where it's cheaper to deal with and out of sight, out of mind.
Right. Yeah.
Barry Commoner said once, there's no such place as away when you throw something away.
Yeah, where is away? Right. Somebody else's. Okay, there's been a lot of discussion in chat. I have not been able to keep up with it, but I don't want to block anyone. Who's there? Who else would like to jump in and make some comments to everyone, or anything on the chat list here that I may have missed and somebody wants to bring up? We got a couple more minutes. We should wrap up soon, but I don't want to overlook it. Any comments from anyone?
Randy, to that last point about work, I just posted something in the chat there. We had here in Edmonton, when I arrived 30 years ago, it was actually a Christians group in part. There were other groups involved in getting recycling off the ground here. And it's been amazing uptake. Residential uptake on recycling is 95% of the homes comply. And so there are these enormous kinds of challenges that have to be overcome. But what worked 30 years ago is no longer working today because conditions are constantly changing. And that's the hardest part. We are creatures of habit. I tell you, when Campbell's Soup changed the labels on their soup, I was lost in Safeway grocery store for months trying to find my favorite soup. And that's an old guy's disease. I recognize my parents, and I'm going through the same thing. My parents always complained about that. So there's these very interesting human scale challenges that often don't come in. So these articles have been so helpful to help us bring together and kind of focus our attention. And I'm always reminded of how unique the ASA is in bringing different people together, different disciplines into, and we've had 80 years of interdisciplinary conversations. And we know that is the key into the future. And it comes out of our community, it comes out of the community of faith, it comes out of the deference, the grace that we extend to one another in these conversations. So it's a very fruitful discussion. I've been reminded of things that I haven't thought about for years, literally. And I'm thinking, hey, yes, I need to pay attention to that for the common good, for the good of us all. And so often when we think about solutions, we think about what works for me. Well, yeah, it has to work for you, but it really has to work for all of us. And that's a gospel value and narrative. It's not just about me, it's about all of us together.
Right. Okay, I'd like to give each of these authors a chance for a final word if they wish. Not required to, but how about a final word from each of you? Steve, you want to get the ball rolling here, or?
Yeah, it's just been a wonderful discussion. Thanks to everybody. Thanks for setting it up, but thanks for all of our colleagues for joining and just for a civil discussion. I was going to pull up the old comment: reduce, reuse, recycle. Recycle was the third of those three words, and so reduce and reuse. Brittany's giving me a thumbs up, an old-fashioned thumbs up. Yeah, so just something to think about. But I do just want to really thank people for a very civil discussion and hope that we'll continue this. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Steve, for putting all this together and getting us going on it. Jay?
I want to use my time to ask Brittany to comment to something that I wrote to her privately. What is the evidence that these little plastics are harmful? And I love these shirts that breathe and everything. Every time I brush these off, I'm sending microplastics into the environment. And how do we know it's harmful? And speak to that again, as you did.
Sure. Yeah, I thought I had replied to you in the chat privately, but it's probably worth saying it out loud for everybody. The research on the harm of these microplastic pieces is kind of all over the board. Recently placed in lab settings, so they're amping up the concentration of microplastics, kind of to extreme levels. And so, you have to take all of this into consideration. The goal of the paper is not to say that we should be alarmist about microplastics, but that we should be extremely cautious. For the most part, microplastics pass through the digestive system. But there is research, and I think that there should be a few references from my paper that show that there are, in some cases, trophic transfers up the food chain. And there's also the possibility of contamination from environmental toxins that get concentrated onto microplastics. Nanoplastics is a whole nother subject, which, to be perfectly honest, is probably more serious than microplastics because of the size that nanoparticles can pass through barriers which microplastics cannot. So definitely, if you're interested in plastics, keep your eyes out for research on nanoplastics. But finally, there's also research going into the physical characteristics of microplastics and how those interact with microorganisms. So if you think about like the very small microbeads that used to be in our face wash and our toothpaste in the US, which was banned in 2015 by Congress, the microbead ban, those sort of things don't pose many problems, but the microfibers from your shirt might cause a little Daphnia to get tangled up and to be hindered from, say, swimming. So there are possibilities of population level effects, but there's a lot more research that could be and should be done. And I'm hoping that it will be done.
Very good. Matthew.
I would just end, I guess, by reminding everyone about Genesis 2, Adam's naming of the creatures, that God brings them to Adam to name. And in that passage, I see Adam there as the everyman, that we are called to name the creatures that are around us as an act of learning about them and learning to love them. Mm-hmm. And so as we encounter these foods, if we don't know the creature we're eating, we probably shouldn't be eating it. We should take the time to learn the identities of these things that we're consuming.
I'm going to starve before I have anything to eat then.
I don't think it's as challenging as you're making it out to be.
But it takes more time.
Do you sell those DNA sequencers for the home use? I can have at home. I can.
Yeah, we have to sequence the DNA of everything we eat. Great.
I don't think so. I see here in Calgary, there's been some big on the ground changes put in place by pressure from citizens. So when I moved to Calgary 10 years ago, everything was just labeled as fish, salmon or tuna, and that was about it. But now there are species-specific names put on many labels, not all, certainly not even close to all, but a lot more than there used to be. And we're finding that those things that are labeled with a full species identifier are far less likely to be mislabeled than things that are ambiguously labeled. And these were on the ground, people voting with their wallets that implemented these sorts of changes. So I don't think it's as challenging as you're making it seem. Other big changes that have happened. Calgary recently banned shark fin products. There are ways that, although this all seems so overwhelming as a consumer, there are very just simple, practical changes that, if we do collectively, add up to industry paying attention.
Wow, that's great. Let's see, Brittany, you already commented, right? Did you have anything else to add?
Well, I guess Jay didn't get a chance to comment because
because he asked a question. He said that's what he was going to do. So
I yielded.
Yeah, he yielded, right. So I just want to say that's a great add-on here. I'm delighted. There's so much more to talk about. I do hope that any of you on this call if you're part of an ASA chapter. If you aren't, get on one. But have some follow-on discussions about this. Pick an aspect of this. I know all of these authors would be more than happy to participate if you wish, and dig a little deeper in some of these topics. But this is what ASA is all about, just the kind of fellowship of Christians in the sciences where we can share ideas and talk about things from both scientific and a scriptural perspective. So now, Vicki, I think you can put the link on the chat or something if you don't have it, as to where the recording of this is going to be. And I want to know whether that recording is going to include the chat or not, because the chat list I don't seem to be able to download, and several of you are saying here you can't download it either. But I certainly didn't get a chance to read it all. So is that possible, Vicki?
Yeah, we saved that, Randy, so that...
The chat?
Yeah.
Was that be part of the recording then?
It can be.
Yeah, please. Okay, because we've been having some requests for that. That's great. And also there was a question here about the annual meeting. Would you like to comment on that? What's coming up?
Yeah, I'd love to. Great conversation, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Randy mentioned the chapters, and I'm reminded that looks like Noel Anderson is on. He's one of the leaders of our new Red River Valley chapter, and they're actually having a follow-on meeting right after this. So they'll be able to carry on the conversation. Who would have ever thought a year ago, when we canceled the annual meeting for the first time in 75 years, that we would be in a decision mode about whether to do so again this summer? Wouldn't have thought it in a million years, but we're in, John and I are in conversation we have a planning team in place on the ground at Point Loma Nazarene, as well as our staff here in the office. And we're weighing all of our options and considering whether we will indeed be face-to-face in San Diego or not. So we plan to make a decision by the end of this month. You'll be hearing from us. One of the things that we've learned as part of this COVID season is our new normal will include things like this and the ability to meet virtually. So moving forward, we will definitely have a virtual aspect of our annual meeting. So whether we are solely virtual or face-to-face and virtual this summer, we're in that discernment process right now, and we will let you know by the end of March. So you can expect to hear from us very soon. As much as we want to be face-to-face, we miss all of you. We're working with conference services and just weighing all the variables. So we look forward to communicating again by the end of this month.
Okay, that's terrific. And so with that, I would like to thank each of you as authors for participating here. Thank you for your articles, and thank all the rest of you for your participation. And I hope to see you all next time, April 10, when we talk about vaccine hesitancy. Farewell. God be with you.
That'll be a great time. And Vicki, a virtual volleyball game, can we do that?
Oh, I think we can make that work, Jay. Yeah, we'll have to do that.
I did mean to bring donuts for everyone today.
Yeah.
Aww.
You can put those on the chat line, yeah.
Right.